it is customary to begin discussions of philosophy in general with the figure of Socrates. Much has been made over the ages about this enigmatic and in many ways elusive thinker. Now, as always, I'm going to have to be superficial, and I'm going to merely attempt to suggest maybe some of the ways for you to get into the figure of Socrates, but take this as an invitation, as always, to do your own research at your own pace. So we could spend many classes just discussing the Socratic problem, who Socrates was and what he stood for. But in this course, I want to suggest possibly like the main idea for which Socrates stands for is the notion of the dialogue. Now, Socrates himself notoriously did not write anything. He did not write treatises. He did not write his philosophical ideas down. Instead, he preferred to engage in a face-to-face live discussion with his fellow citizens. These discussions, also quite importantly, were mostly of a private character. And even if they took place in public, as often they did, still, Socrates did not speak to the Athenians as a whole, address Athenians as a whole, but he addressed himself to particular individual people, most of whom were his friends or people he knew otherwise, right? And you can see immediately the most famous phrase, the most famous statement that survives from Socrates is this notion, I know that I know nothing. Right? And you can, I hope you can see the relationship between this dialogical nature of his philosophical enterprise and this commitment to the idea that, well, how can we understand this? That human knowledge is limited. It is because human knowledge is limited, one needs to engage in a philosophical dialogue with other people. Now, also, because Socrates never wrote anything, our main source for the ideas of Socrates is going to be the dialogues of Plato. So when I talk about Socrates in our course, I'm mostly going to be talking about a character as portrayed by Plato. It's a whole separate question, and there are reasons to believe that Plato is not merely writing down the things and like verbatim things that he has heard from Socrates, but is actually using Socrates as not necessarily a mouthpiece for his ideas, but as presenter of some interesting and important arguments, right? So there's this very important commitment that we see in Socrates, but later taken up by his supposed student Plato, commitment to a free and open discussion, So again, I already mentioned Plato, so Socrates never wrote anything, but Plato never wrote anything in his own voice, as far as we can tell. Whenever Plato writes, he writes dialogues which have often many characters, Socrates only one among them. And again, many ways to interpret this. I would suggest to interpret, again, both the character of Socrates and of Plato through this commitment to open-ended discussion, right? Socrates or Plato, they are not religious prophets, unlike, let's say, Homer. They do not pretend to speak truth from the gods. Instead, they are trying to propose certain arguments, and arguments in this sense would be much more important than conclusions. So arguments would be more important than conclusions, and a conclusion, unless it is substantiated by a good argument, a conclusion by itself is really worth nothing, right? And I hope you can see, we talked about the sophists already, how this is potentially a somewhat dangerous enterprise. So the promise of this approach is that it will teach individuals to think for themselves. Socrates and Plato appear to not be indoctrinating their interlocutors into a particular position. They're not trying to convert them into their own position, but they are trying to help other people, presumably, develop their own ideas. Again, Socrates in Plato's dialogues describes himself as a gadfly who stings people by asking uneasy, uncomfortable questions. So in this sense, he's a gadfly. He asks uncomfortable questions, and questions being more important than answers. So arguments more important than conclusions, and questions more important than answers. So in this sense, Socrates is a gadfly, but also in his capacity as a gadfly, he acts as a midwife. He doesn't tell people what to think, but he helps people develop their own ideas. But now, going back to the sophists, the danger of this enterprise is that you can never guarantee what kind of conclusions you're going to end up with, right? So many people, when they begin doing philosophy, they hope that the philosophical enterprise will help them substantiate or ground ideas which they already have. But in fact, again, the danger of philosophy, the danger of this open-ended enterprise is that maybe you will end up with very different conclusions as compared to what you have begun with, right? Philosophy may change you in ways which may be subversive or even dangerous. And again, the perennial accusation against philosophy, which we can see in the figure of Socrates himself, is that philosophy undermines religious piety and patriotic faith. So religious faith and civic faith. So religion, demands of religion and demands of patriotism could be said to center around the notion of unquestioned obedience. But again, this idea, no, I will not accept any conclusions unless they are independently grounded in a sound argument, right? This could potentially lead one to suspect, in general, could undermine one's commitment to one's religion or to one's country. And again, notice the famous or infamous trial of Socrates is complicated and multifaceted, but at least on the surface level, the charge against Socrates is precisely that he is corrupting the young, he is unfaithful to the Athenian gods, and maybe he's an atheist, or maybe he's introducing new divinities. And this accusation against philosophy, this is a perennial accusation, and this shows you, again, in the figure of Socrates and in his fate, it shows you the danger of philosophical enterprise as a whole. So there's a promise, but also the danger and the challenge. And one kind of proceeds naturally from the other. Okay, so this is the broad outline of what Socrates was, as far as we can tell. Let us talk in more detail about the particular doctrines which came to be associated with the name of Socrates. Now, I want to briefly introduce another, I think, very important topic to keep in mind. So we are talking about history of philosophy, history of ideas. I think it's very important to understand that ideas have social conditions or social circumstances. It is possible to write a social history of ideas. I guess there are two moments I want to focus on. The first is Marx's famous dictum that in any society, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, the ideas of the rulers, basically. And I think this notion stands to reason. It is mostly only the rich and powerful who have the leisure to think, and also the power and the resources to preserve and to propagate their ideas, to spread their ideas. We shall see Socrates presumably is willing to talk to just about anybody in Athens, but actually when we read the dialogues, mostly he talks to the members of the aristocracy and of the merchant class. And in general, Socrates himself definitely, at the very least, has the leisure time to engage in philosophy. Now, the source of Socrates' leisure is kind of interesting. It's not that he is rich, right? But Socrates is something a bit of an ascetic. a very important thesis. He is not rich who has much, but he is rich who needs little. So Socrates is rich in leisure time, not on the account of his wealth, but on the account of his self-control over his passions. And I think it's very important to understand this is both a problematic position, right? Ideas of the ruling class tend to be the ruling ideas. Something, a bit of a danger, something that we have to be aware as we are reading these thinkers, right? All of these thinkers are writing from a particular social standpoint, mostly standpoint of the rulers, again, in order to have the leisure time and also in order to have the power to preserve the ideas. And again, think about Socrates. The dialogues were written down by Plato, and then they were preserved by later generations. This was a costly process. Transmission of ideas is not innocent. Transmission of ideas is not innocent. Even if it's not the rulers who make the ideas, it is the rulers of the future, right, who decide which ideas of the past they are going to preserve. Now, I'm not saying that this disqualifies the argument. It does not. I don't think it does. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful. But another thing I want to mention is that philosophy, since ancient times, philosophy is luxury. Philosophy requires leisure, and leisure is luxury. Again, Plato uses this word schole, which in Greek means leisure time. This is what is, essentially what philosophy is. It is what free individuals who have the means to engage in philosophy and who have the intellectual capacity to engage in philosophy freely decide to engage in philosophy in their own spare time. And philosophy as an essence of liberal education, of an education of a free person. Philosophy, if you want, as the art of living, as the supremely practical enterprise, learning how to be a master of oneself. And in many ways, it's a complicated story, but students often ask me, why should we do philosophy? Why should we do philosophy? And it's always a bit of an uneasy answer from me because, again, in my view, since ancient times, doing philosophy was a privilege, right? You didn't have to explain why you did philosophy. Doing philosophy is something anybody would do if they could afford it. Because again, the key question of philosophy is, how should I live my life? Asking the most important questions and providing your own answers. Again, Socrates has this phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. If you yourself do not think about your life, if you do not ask questions about your life, it seems you might as well be dead. You are not living your life. If you do not think for yourself, others think for you. Is that a life worthy of a human being? Now, another important aspect of the social history of ideas is that basically every philosopher writes in response to the problems and the challenges of the day. Now, in our course as a whole, I have proposed that the main question, or one of the main, in my interpretation, the main question of political philosophy is the question or the problem of autonomy. If human beings are born free, they can only be subjected with their own consent, according to their own free will. So the only obedience worthy of a human being is free obedience. Right? Now, within the ancient Greek context, this question is colored by particular challenges of the day. So specifically, we are talking about something of a crisis in the ancient Greek society. And broadly speaking, again, when we look at Socrates and Plato, and especially at Plato's Republic, there are two primary challenges that Plato is thinking about. He is thinking about how can you protect the polis, a small city-state, from enemies abroad. So the polis needs to be strong enough to protect itself from the threat of outside force. The ancient Greeks were continuously at war. And even though the Greeks had a notion of Hellas, Greece, as a cultural entity, at the same time, each city-state was an independent political entity. So there was, by and large, no patriotism vis-a-vis Greece as a whole, right? And the individual polis, the individual city-states, were actually constantly at war with one another, not to mention enemies outside of the Greek sphere, right? the Greeks called, by and large, non-Greeks, barbarians, right? The most ominous threat actually came from the Persian Empire, right? But still, again, this was not an academic, this was not an abstract question. How do you protect the polis from enemies abroad? So, the war was a constant reality of ancient Greek life. And the second issue is how do you maintain harmony at home? Specifically, how do you protect yourself against civil war? Now, just to be on the safe side, so the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, should not be described as a civil war, right? Athens and Sparta were two separate entities. Today we would think of them as two separate countries. But within the cities, within individual cities, very often factions were engaged in bitter conflict. And I don't want to say very often, but from time to time, individual city-states collapsed into chaos. One very dramatic example that Thucydides gives is the civil war within Corcyra. And he talks about the horrible and calamitous situation. And he talks about how during the time of civil war, all the normal human values are turned upside down. And the normal everyday virtues of level-headedness and moderation are perceived as signs of weakness and, more importantly, treachery, right? So against these two challenges to the stability of the city-state, it seems that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would tend to think of justice in terms of harmony. And again, so harmony, like individual harmony and social harmony. Now, when I say individual harmony and social harmony, we presuppose that, let's say, the social whole is made of parts, right? So society is made up of classes, or let's say society is made up of individuals. And harmony in society is harmony between the parts, between the classes or between the individuals. The individual harmony, and we'll talk about this more later down the line, presumes that the human body is also a multitude. Today we would say, okay, human beings have organs, human beings have cells, and they have to be in harmony, but much more importantly, the idea is that the human psyche, human psychology, human soul, if you want, the Greek word psyche is the root of our word psychology, right? Psyche. The human soul is also made up of parts. We have different various desires, different various inclinations. Nietzsche would say that there are many souls inhabiting one's psyche, which are at war with one another. From the idea, which may be familiar to some of you from, let's say, works of Sigmund Freud, right? And so the social harmony is harmony between the parts of the city, and the individual harmony is harmony between the parts of the soul, right? In many ways, this is the goal that these ancient philosophers are trying to achieve. Again, more or less, I'm oversimplifying a bit, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And this is, in many ways, this is their response to the challenge of the sophists. How do we know that justice is really in our interest and not, let's say, the mask of class interest or factional interest or just some kind of lie or ideology, right? True justice reflects real harmony, it seems. This is what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle appear to be trying to establish. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is, again, continuing this notion of social conditions. Let's think of the anthropological reconstruction, the evolution of human communities. The current thinking, in current thinking, anthropological thinking, the idea is that human beings begin in very small, tightly knit communities of some like hunter-gathering tribes, maybe 40, 50, up to 100 individuals, right? And the notion is that within these small communities, justice tends to be natural. In a similar fashion, how we think in a well-functioning, well-ordered families, justice is natural. The parents, by and large, do not have, in good families, we don't think have the incentive to lie to children or to steal from their children, or brothers steal from their sisters, right? There's a certain understanding that we have within a family, we have a very pronounced common interest. Families are different. Some families, unfortunately, are dysfunctional, but kind of within this ideal, which I hope you can relate to, at least to some extent. So within small communities, small primitive, in the technical sense of the term, communities, the idea is that justice is to a very large extent, natural. And human beings naturally want to cooperate, want to treat each other well, because, again, today I do something for you, tomorrow you do something for me. Or, much more importantly, tomorrow we have enemies at the gates, wild beasts, or maybe other communities. And today I do something good for you, but tomorrow I will ask your help in our common defense against a common threat. But as societies grow larger, it becomes increasingly difficult for this natural mechanism to operate. And so, again, in many ways, we will see how for Plato in the Republic and for Aristotle in his Politics, justice is artificial. Again, nature and artifice, physis and nomos. Aristotle is going to say that man is by nature, by physis, a nomos-making animal. Man by nature is a convention-making animal. So our justice is conventional. In large and complex communities, it needs to be established by art, by artifice. But still, although it is established artificially, like it is man-made, it is made according to human hands, but the ideal of justice actually reflects objective harmony. It's not a mere convention, as the sophists have thought. Now, let us examine, so to speak, the positive doctrines of Socrates. Now, immediately, this phrase, positive doctrine, has to be taken not with a grain, but with a tablespoon of salt. I remind you, colleagues, that Socrates spoke dialogues and Plato wrote dialogues. And I feel that within this dialogue form, there's a very important skeptical and potentially maybe even a sophistic element. Right? So in what sense? In the sense that Socrates and Plato are not religious prophets who are telling the truth with a capital T. I feel that the value of Socratic and Platonic enterprise is that they hypothetically propose arguments which they think are good and interesting arguments, but they invite us to think through these arguments and not just to accept them on faith. Right? Also, very importantly, I feel that we must rectify a little bit of a historical injustice. When we talk about Plato these days, especially about Platonism, there's a certain stereotype about what Platonism is. Again, this quasi-religious doctrine about the theory of forms or ideas which exist somewhere in the metaphysical realms. I want to stress that in many ways, I feel, from a historical philosophical standpoint, this popular Plato is closer to, for historical reasons, is closer to a Neoplatonic and especially Christian Neoplatonic, but also, I suppose, Jewish Neoplatonic and Muslim Neoplatonic interpretations of Plato. These are much later interpretations. So the most important Neoplatonist, whose name is Plotinus, is writing in Roman Egypt more than 500 years after the works of, after the lifetime of Socrates, roughly speaking. So 5 centuries have passed, right? And after the span of 5 centuries, in the works of people like Plotinus, Socrates and Plato are turned into something like religious prophets, maybe even proto-Christian religious prophets. But I want us to be very careful with this interpretation. Again, and I want to remind everyone that immediately after the death of Plato, the Platonic Academy was actually the seat of skepticism, the so-called academic skepticism, academic skeptics, right? And probably the most famous figure in the history of academic skeptic, at least in terms of being able to recognize the name, is Cicero. So Cicero, again, another Roman author, actually studied in Athens, much later also in Plato's Academy, and basically was trained as an academic skeptic, right? And so within this skeptical interpretation of Plato, again, Socrates and Plato write dialogues because they do not themselves have yet reached the truth. They have maybe some tentative hypothesis that it's interesting or fruitful maybe to talk through, but not anything like truth with a capital T. And again, this very famous phrase of Socrates, "I know that I know nothing," of course, naturally yields to some kind of skeptical conclusion. So this is a bit of a methodological precaution that I want to stress before we begin. It's not just a precaution, but also, I think, a very important methodological point, because in many ways, regardless of what Socrates or Plato thought, I invite us, colleagues, in this course to take this stance to every question, to every idea, to every philosopher. In this course ideally, hopefully, is not about indoctrination, but this course, again, within the Socratic spirit in this sense, is my best attempt to introduce you to the arguments, to show you what are the potential arguments, not ask you to accept conclusions, but to look at the arguments and to examine the arguments. And ideally, by the end of the course, to come up with your own ideas, or like even if you end up, let's say, agreeing with my positions, although I try to keep my positions out of this course, but even if you agree with my positions, you agree with them for your own reasons. In a similar fashion, how like in every science, in physics or in mathematics, again, we use, let's say, Einsteinian physics, not because we believe that Einstein was a religious prophet, but because we can examine, verify, and ultimately, tentatively and provisionally, hypothetically, but still agree for the time being with his ideas. Now, if we were to talk about Socrates specifically, first of all, we have to ask, how can we disentangle Socrates from Plato? I already said that it probably cannot be done in a reliable fashion, but there's a hypothetical schema that we should be careful with, and we should take it with a grain of salt. But some scholars believe that it is possible to divide Plato's dialogues into three periods: the early, the middle, and the later dialogues. And within this schema, the early dialogues would represent something like the Socratic position. So this is basically going to be Socrates in the early dialogues of Plato. As a matter of fact, going back to this notion of Socrates and Plato as maybe a bit of sophists and skeptics, again, we could imagine that Plato begins in the early dialogues by more or less retelling Socratic ideas. We cannot be sure of that, but let's imagine. Then in the middle dialogues, notice, because Socrates is not a prophet, but Socrates is just proposing some arguments, it is natural for Plato to develop these arguments. And so in the middle period, presumably, potentially, Plato is going to develop his own ideas. So the characteristic early dialogue is going to be, let's say, the Apology or Euthyphro. The characteristic middle dialogue then potentially could be Republic. And we'll talk about Republic in much more detail in a second. So, Republic. But then, as a testimony to the open-mindedness of Plato, within this interpretative schema, there are also late dialogues or later dialogues. And I would single a couple, always with a question mark, because this chronology is very provisional. Dialogues don't come with dates attached to them, so it's some stylographic evidence, but the evidence is problematic. In terms of the later dialogues, I would single out two. One is the Laws, and in the dialogue of the Laws, Plato seems to reconsider the political schema that he gives in the Republic. We'll talk about this in much more detail in a second. Another dialogue is Parmenides. And in the dialogue Parmenides, Plato actually advances what seems to be the most important and the most devastating critique of the theory of forms. So if this interpretation is correct, then the dialogue Parmenides, so to speak, proves or indicates that Plato was not a Neoplatonist and actually might not have believed in the theory of forms or ideas in this Platonic realm, in this sense. So still, again, imagining that this schema has something to do with reality, let's look at the early dialogues, again, mostly I would say Apology and Euthyphro, and try to distill some of the ideas from them. First of all, very famously, Socrates says, he knows that he knows nothing. Again, in the dialogue Apology, Socrates talks about how presumably God Apollo, through the oracle at Delphi, says that human intellect is limited and actually human wisdom isn't worth much. So he is wise. In fact, he is the wisest of all men who, like Socrates, knows that he knows nothing. Right? It's kind of not actually a denial of knowledge, but maybe a certain kind of negative knowledge. You know that there are limits to human understanding or to human intellectual enterprise. So, again, even though I spent a lot of time talking about the skeptical and the sophistic elements in Plato and Socrates, and especially, again, this testimony, this testament, Socrates says that he knows nothing. At the same time, Socrates seems to espouse certain conclusions. There are four I want to focus on. But I think in this spirit, it's very important to understand that these conclusions, I believe, Socrates takes as hypothetical and provisional. It's not like he knows them to be true. No, for the time being, the force of the better argument seems to move him towards these conclusions, so provisionally he accepts them. And in fact, he engages in the dialogues with other people precisely because he wants to examine these conclusions, right? Not as truths, but as methodological, hypothetical, tentative conclusions that we are trying to examine, and not truths with capital T. So the first notion is, again, this idea in Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living. The most important thing that we can do, the most important activity we can engage in as conscious beings is thinking for ourselves, and especially thinking about the notions of morality. But I suppose the most important question you could say is the question of what is the meaning of life? In more practical terms, what is the meaning of life in a sense what makes life meaningful? What should I do with my life? What is the good in life? And this notion of the good is actually captured by Socrates and by later Greek tradition with the word arete. And arete could be translated as virtue and was translated by Christians as virtue. But actually the ancient Greek connotations are somewhat different. Arete, first and foremost, means excellence. What is it like to live an excellent life? The best human life. Immediately, we could say that this is a bit of an anti-liberal presupposition. People today might be inclined to think that there's no one right way to live one's life, right? And the ancient Greeks might have, and especially Socrates, might have disagreed with that. And no, there actually is a standard of the excellence of a human life. That, a knife can be objectively good or objectively bad. A horse can be objectively good and objectively bad. And a human life can be objectively good and objectively bad. There's a right way to live one's life. Now also, when we talk about this arete, it's important, or excellence, it's important to understand that different Greek authors would understand this differently. So in the Iliad and Odyssey, Homer also talks about arete. So the arete of Odysseus is that his excellence is that he's an excellent liar. He can lie to people convincingly. The arete, or the excellence, of Achilles is that he's an excellent pirate, an excellent robber, an excellent murderer, killer. He roams around the Mediterranean, plundering cities, killing men and enslaving women, right? So the word itself doesn't mean anything, right? Different thinkers will have different ideas. And let me immediately signal, right? Socrates will not agree with Homer. He's going to say that the excellence of a human being is not the excellence of lying, not the excellence of murdering, or the excellence of gratifying your appetites. But for Socrates, the excellence of a human being is the excellence of thinking for oneself and deciding for oneself in accordance with the force of the better argument, what is the right way to live. And again, I keep talking about this question of the better argument. Jürgen Habermas, right, the 20th century, 21st century philosopher, still alive at the time of this recording. Jürgen Habermas has this wonderful phrase, der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. The only power which a free citizen recognizes, a free person recognizes, is the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. Yes, you obey reason, but you obey freely because you agree with the ideas. Now, within this presupposition, and have to immediately bring this to light, right? The idea is that, again, the unexamined life is not worth living. The most important thing we do is think. It seems that Socrates presupposes that thinking is going to lead to some sort of harmonious or pro-social conclusions. Socrates does not seem to entertain the possibility that thinking very carefully could lead to the sophistic, Kallipolis or Thrasymachus style conclusions, which would expose the social order as coercive and violent, right? So Socrates seems to presuppose, although can he really prove that? It's not clear. Seems to presuppose that thinking is a service, or teaching people to think is a service to the community, right? And in fact, that actually all vice, all badness, all conflict, disharmony comes from ignorance. And on the flip side, that excellence, this arete, excellence, comes from knowledge and leads to happiness. Excellence is one, it is attainable through knowledge and it leads to happiness. So much so that to a good man, Socrates says, no harm can come in this life or the next. And this is a very important notion. So we talked in the previous segment about Critias, right, who says that it is not, potentially, it is not gods who make men, but men who invent gods in order to, as an ideology that is supposed to make, stabilize the social bond, let's say, make men more obedient. So immediately there's this very important question: what about the afterlife? What about the afterlife? Again, within this Neoplatonic synthesis, together with this metaphysical doctrine of the eternal world of forms, there's another idea that the human soul is like the immortal forms, immortal, changeless, and indestructible forms. And in fact, the human soul will continue to exist after death. Now, very explicitly, Socrates in Plato's Apology says that he doesn't know what's going to happen to us after we die. And again, in various dialogues in which Socrates advances these moral conclusions, it seems that Socrates will sometimes say that also knowledge will lead to some form of happy afterlife, but he never relies on it solely. He will never rely only on this justification. So to say this differently, Socrates says that maybe if there's an afterlife, then good life here will secure you, the excellent life here on this earth will secure a happy afterlife. However, the happy life here, the happy and excellent life here, is lived first and foremost for its own sake, regardless of what happens to us after we die. In the Apology, Socrates very dramatically says that we do not know what happens. Maybe he entertains two possibilities. He says that maybe death is extinction, and there's nothing after we die. He says we could compare it to a dreamless sleep. Death is the complete and utter end. So maybe it's extinction, or maybe, even if there is some continuation in the afterlife, well, he talks about the ancient Greek views of Hades or the underworld. And he says that regardless, either way, philosophy is the best way to live, whether death is the end or whether we're going to face Hades after we die. Now, one last issue I want to mention, and lamentably, there's absolutely no time to go into this, so I invite you to do your own reading, is of course the famous or the infamous trial and death of Socrates. Again, let me remind you that the formal charges against Socrates is that he is corrupting the young and that he is impious towards the gods. So he corrupts the young. So potentially a political charge of unpatriotism and impiety towards the gods. Again, as I suggested, the perennial dangers of doing philosophy, because again, Socrates, like the sophists, seems to be unsatisfied in simply accepting the prejudice of his society. He wants arguments, and without a good argument, he's not willing to accept them. Now, actually, the trial and death of Socrates is a super complicated story. So one potential thing to keep in mind is that the trial takes place after the disastrous Peloponnesian War, which lasted for 30 years and ended with the victory of Sparta and defeat of Athens, and the Spartans actually installed a dictatorship of the 30, a dictatorship of the aristocratic party, right? And the problem is that Socrates appears to have been associated with this aristocratic party. So it could very well be that the Athenians decided to execute Socrates as a revenge against the treacherous tyranny of the 30. Again, the 30 tyrants ruled Athens for a short period of time, and then there was a popular democratic uprising, and they were overthrown. And it could be that this was simply a revenge against Socrates because he was associated with the 30, although to what extent Socrates actually endorsed their actions or agreed with their ideas is a more complicated story. So I want you to understand that there's historical complexity. But if we were to try to just stay on the surface level of the charges, it's a very good and a very interesting question. Was Socrates actually guilty? And I have to tell you that many philosophers over the ages, probably the most famous among them, Hegel would say that yes, Socrates was guilty of the charges. Now, Hegel, of course, is going to say that all of this wonderful philosophical enterprise is good and productive and wonderful, and Socrates was right in his own sense, in his own right. But the Athenians really had to execute Socrates because Socrates, as a matter of fact, did erode the foundations of ancient Greek society. So basically, in some sense, Hegel wants to suggest that it was too early for Socratic ideas, or let's say that maybe it was that the time was right to express those ideas, but Socrates had to die for those ideas nonetheless. So again, in terms of this impiety and corrupting the young, just let me give you an example. I think a very important example. So again, imagine Athens in this very drawn out, very tragic war that lasted close to 30 years. Now imagine Socrates asking these questions about examination of life. Imagine this against the background of this terrible conflict. So in one of the dialogues, in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates talks to a general, an important Athenian general, well actually two generals, Nicias and Laches, and he asks them, what is courage? And they cannot give him an answer, right? You see, this is potentially a deep problem. It's kind of, I want to say philosophy is practical because it asks these important questions and allows us to step back. But philosophy could also appear to be deeply impractical and in fact poisonous when it is time to act, right? Because in the middle of the battle, when the officer shouts an order, is this the time to pause and think whether the order is good or not good? Complicated question, complicated issue. So again, it's obviously potentially endless discussion, but colleagues, I invite you to think about this question. Was Socrates guilty? To what extent he was guilty? Or maybe bracketing the question of guilt, was it right that the Athenians executed Socrates? Could it be, could society tolerate this kind of open-mindedness? So interesting, controversial, problematic points, but I invite you, which is the proper philosophical way to do, to examine the arguments on both sides, of the issue, and maybe even resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. And I think there's some indication in Plato's dialogues, Crito, and maybe even in the Republic, that maybe even Plato himself, potentially even Socrates himself, thought that it was proper for Socrates to die. As a last footnote, running the risk of being far too pedantic about this, I also want to stress that actually it was, sometimes people like to draw analogies between Socrates and Jesus. I think there's a deep disanalogy between Socrates and Jesus because, honestly, the Athenians did not necessarily want Socrates to die. The way Athenians' courts worked is that there was no judge, there was only the jury, and the accusing side and the defense each proposed a penalty. So the accusing side, the Democratic Party actually, Anytus and Meletus, proposed death to Socrates, and Socrates himself, as his own punishment, and again, the jury will have to vote between these two. As his own punishment, Socrates proposed that he be fed at the expense of the state for the rest of his life actually, by giving him, the city of Athens was supposed to provide for him Olympic banquets reserved for Olympic champions for the rest of his life. So in many ways, Athenians certainly saw Socrates as subversive, voted that Socrates was actually subverting, but they didn't necessarily vote for Socrates to die. And it seems that Socrates took this uncompromising position. So in many ways, this could even be seen as a little bit of a philosophical suicide, where Socrates was saying, either you have to agree with me or kill me, right? It was in many ways Socrates himself who chose this fate. And again, in the later dialogue, Crito, he goes into deeper reasons as why he thinks it is preferable for him to drink poison, to drink hemlock, as opposed to, let's say, escaping into other cities. But I guess enough about this, and let's move on to our next topic. Let's examine the ideas of potentially of the middle dialogue of Socrates' most illustrious students, Plato. Finally, we get to Plato's Republic. Quite possibly the greatest book ever written. Obviously a controversial statement, but among the great books of the history of the world, I think Republic occupies a very special place. It's a kind of dialogue that you can read and reread year after year after year. And there are layers of meaning, layers upon layers, hidden in the dialogue. Now, I would imagine most great books are like this, that they disclose their meaning in layers. But Republic, again, plays a very special role. In many ways, it is the foundational text of the history of Western philosophy as a whole, and of political philosophy in particular. It's a dialogue about everything. Theory of knowledge, theory of truth, epistemology, theory of reality, ontology, but also of individual morality and political philosophy. And in many ways, I think most of the rest of the history of Western philosophy can be seen as a series of responses to Plato, and many of those responses are actually anticipated by Plato himself. One should not forget, however, that Plato's Republic is first and foremost a dialogue. It is not a treatise. It doesn't have one right doctrine or one right answer. First and foremost, it invites us to look at the different arguments and how they interact. And again, I remind you that Plato's Republic is supposedly, presumably, Plato's middle dialogue, and then in the later dialogues, especially the Laws and Parmenides, some of the ideas of the Republic are critically re-examined. So Plato's Republic is a dialogue. It is a dialogue nominally about justice. The word republic in Greek politeia refers to a regime, a constitution of a particular city. So presumably, judging by the title and the title question of the dialogue, it is a work about justice. What makes a city just? Now, conclusions up front. In the center of the dialogue, we're going to see the city-soul analogy, the analogy between the political city and the individual soul. And it appears that the kind of definition of justice that Socrates is going to propose within dialogue, again, we have to remember, Plato does not speak in his own voice. Socrates, within Plato's dialogue, proposes a certain solution. And the proposed solution is that justice is harmony. Justice is harmony. An individual soul contains the various parts. We will see, again, anticipation of what Freud will later talk about, Freud and Nietzsche and Foucault and many others. So the soul is made of parts, a human individual psyche. Whether the soul is immortal or not, if you want consciousness, consists of many parts. And the harmony between them is the justice or the well-being of the individual, the source of individual excellence also, and happiness, I guess. And then within the polis, the harmony between individuals, the harmony between classes, the harmony between parts of the city, constitutes the justice of the city. So, in an important sense, right, this is a response to the sophistic challenge. So we go from this uncritical, pre-critical acceptance of religious tradition. We don't think, we just act in an unreflective fashion the way society tells us to, right? We then go through this stage of, if you want, differentiation and disunity, conflict, calling the norms of society into question, and then hopefully on the third stage, we go back to the idea of harmony, but we re-establish it, not in an uncritical, but now through, having passed through this critical phase, we establish this conscious harmony. So again, this schema that we will be coming back to, going from the uncritical, undifferentiated unity, this natural simplicity, through consciousness but conflict, freedom, consciousness but conflict, then coming to the third stage to now conscious reflective harmony. Undifferentiated unity, differentiated disunity, and then differentiated unity. We'll talk more about these words later down the line. So, Republic, the protean, the enigmatic Republic, rich in structure, rich in ideas, so many different interpretations possible. Again, take this as an invitation to read the dialogue on your own, carefully, probably more than once. It's a dialogue that repays rereading. Now, let's try to stay more or less on the surface. Let's try to look at the main ideas of the dialogue, so to speak, at least as they appear superficially. So, the dialogue actually takes place behind closed doors. So this is not Socrates addressing the Athenian assembly, talking to all the people, right? There's an important element here. I'm saying this for a reason, right? Socrates prefers private conversations face to face. There's a difference between this individual personal back and forth and just shouting and trying to convince the Athenian assembly. All sorts of ways in which one can interpret this. One is a topic that we will be coming back to. Plato appears to have been very pessimistic about the possibilities of rhetoric, the notion that the crowd is usually persuaded by arguments which sound nice, which sound appealing, but are not necessarily true. So there's, again, this primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis politics, but also primacy of calm, personal reflection, as opposed to shouting in the agora, shouting in the market square, right? So the dialogue takes place behind closed doors. All sorts of symbolism, no time to go into. The Peloponnesian War is constantly present throughout the dialogue. The dialogue presumably takes place during the Peloponnesian War, right? So we have discussed how justice, very, very importantly, relates to protection from enemies abroad and also protection against insurrection at home. So enemies, this is something that has to be kept in mind. Enemies abroad and faction at home. Both very important, very prescient ideas. Some of the characters of the dialogue, according to tradition, actually died during the civil war in Athens, which took place after the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War. So it's full of symbolism. But still, let's try to focus on the ideas. So Socrates goes into a house of an old, rich merchant whose name is Kallipolis. And Kallipolis, since he's old, right? Socrates asks Kallipolis to share his wisdom of the age. And more specifically, the implication is, what is it like to be old? What is it like to face death? And Kallipolis says something very interesting. He says that as a young man, he was overcome by passion. He was overcome by desire. And because he was overcome by desire, I'm interpreting a little bit, it led him to transgress, to injure people, but also gods. He was not perfectly just because his desires ruled over him. But now he's old, and thankfully he's wealthy. So he can pay his debts to gods and men. So in a very straightforward fashion, he can apologize to the men and maybe women that he has insulted, give them gifts as an apology. And also, he spends most of his old life, it seems, sacrificing and praying to the gods. In fact, in the dialogue, he wears a garland, and he has just come back from performing a sacrifice. So, Socrates immediately takes this as an opportunity to start a dialogue, to start a discussion. And basically, he interprets the words of Kallipolis as Kallipolis' definition of justice, that to be just, the traditional view, is to pay your debts to gods and men. And Socrates, in some sense, is asking, but how do you know? This is going to be a very important question of knowledge, in some sense, that we will be coming back to. How do you know what are your debts to gods and men? See, Kallipolis is a symbol for this uncritical acceptance of tradition. Kallipolis, it appears, is a deeply unreflective man. He just follows the norms of his society. But what happens if there's some kind of complicated situation? Maybe some conflict of obligations, right? So Socrates gives the following story. He says, imagine paying debts to gods and men. Imagine you have borrowed a weapon from a friend, and now your friend is in a fit of rage, fit of madness maybe, is not in control of their action. Should you give them back the axe? I mean, this is not maybe the most interesting example. Immanuel Kant, later down the line, is going to ask, imagine that there's a murderer at your door and he's asking whether your friend is at home. And you presume that the murderer will try to kill your friend. Should you tell the truth, right? Tradition says it's good to tell the truth, but should you do it in this case? Maybe this should be an exception. And Socrates asks this question. The meaning of the question should be very clear. Can you simply rely on tradition all the time? Or could it be that sometimes tradition is just wrong or outdated, or maybe it's, in this particular case, it's an exception. And again, during the Peloponnesian War, I would imagine fighting against enemies abroad and trying to prevent faction at home, people constantly ran in these kinds of conflicts. Socrates himself ran into a problem like this. The government, the tyranny of the 30, was ordering Socrates to participate in potentially an execution of an innocent person, and Socrates refused. Right? This idea of an independent standard of justice. Independent standard of justice, potentially maybe even above the gods. So another dialogue, which we should have talked about if we had more time, called Euthyphro, in which Socrates asks this very important question. Should we simply obey the gods just because they're gods? Or could it be, with a question mark, that there's a higher standard of goodness which is above the gods? Kind of the philosophical challenge of Socrates seems to assert the primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis religion. That you should be religiously pious only if it is good. There's an abstract, universal, objective standard of goodness which is above even the gods. Impersonal standard. Right? Now, faced with this challenge, Kallipolis is unable to respond. He doesn't even want to think about it. He just goes back to continue his sacrifices. If you want, continue praying to the gods and just hope for the best. In an uncritical fashion, again, remember Critias talks about how it's not gods who make men, but men who make gods. And Kallipolis doesn't want to think about any of that. He just goes and prays. And with this, tradition is defeated. Tradition is banished from the dialogue. This is not a satisfactory answer. It is cast aside. Kallipolis has a son, whose name is Polemarchus. Polemarchus actually means general in Greek, and he's an army officer. And as a matter of fact, Polemarchus will be killed in the struggle against the 30 tyrants later down the line. As a matter of fact, the dialogue takes place in the port city of Piraeus, where the key struggle will take place. So again, there's layers of meaning. Apologies, back to the idea. So Polemarchus, Kallipolis' son, wants to amend his father's definition. He wants to make it more concrete. It's not, justice isn't just following tradition. No, there's a criterion. Criterion is the following. Justice, says Polemarchus, is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. Doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. It's a patriotic definition of justice. Now, interesting idea in many ways. Socrates asks an interesting question. Does good, just man, do good men, just men, do they even have enemies? Is it ever just to harm anyone? Kind of a complicated question. But, keeping this question aside, in general, the problem is similar. Kallipolis says, I'm just going to follow the tradition. Socrates asks, how do you know that your tradition is right, that your tradition is good, that your society is not lying to you or misleading you? Likewise, Polemarchus, you're going to help your friends and harm your enemies. Do you know who are your friends? Do you know who are your enemies? And actually, do you know what constitutes harm or help? This has happened to all of us. You think that somebody is your friend and they stab you in the back. You think somebody is your enemy, but turns out you have a common interest. Likewise, you're trying to help somebody but end up hurting them. Right? Again, you see, both in the case of Kallipolis and in the case of Polemarchus, Socrates, in his philosophical fashion, insists on the primacy of knowledge vis-a-vis morality, of philosophy vis-a-vis morality. So finally, an old friend whom we have been expecting, Thrasymachus, bursts on the scene. And Thrasymachus, in this cynical fashion, says, there's no such thing as justice. Justice is simply an ideological lie which masks oppression. Notice, Socrates does not say, oh, that's horrible, oh, that's immoral. And in some sense, I want us to take a pause. I think that Socrates is sympathetic to Thrasymachus. And I ask you, colleagues, to be sympathetic to Thrasymachus as well. Now, I'm imagining, this is my own interpretation. I don't think Thrasymachus is a bad person. Thrasymachus looks around him and he sees the various city-states. He sees the various polis in which there's a stronger party, and this stronger party rules over everybody else. And the stronger party makes laws in their own interest. So yes, Thrasymachus is bitter. He's cynical. But that's not because he's bad. He looks around and he sees bad states, oppression, coercion, violence around him. At least this is my interpretation. Notice what Socrates responds. Socrates says, okay, let's imagine that in any state, it is the rulers who make the rules of justice. But is that good as a definition of justice? How do the rulers themselves know what is in their interest? How do the rulers themselves know what is to their advantage? So in many ways, again, the same question asked to all three. Tradition, how do you know that it's good? Patriotism, how do you know who are your friends? And, this critical stance, sophistic stance. Okay, let's imagine, yes, that justice is an oppression of the stronger. But how does the ruling party, how do they know what is in their interest? I think a very important tacit assumption of the dialogue, and one way of seeing what Plato does, is that actually later down the line, Socrates is going to combine all three definitions. That when you engage in philosophy, when you understand the structure of the world properly, when you understand the nature of society properly, and when you understand the nature of the individual soul properly, then it is possible to create an order, the right, harmonious order, in which, justice is not going to be an ideological, it actually is going to be, there's going to be an element of the noble lie. I'm going to get there in a second. But it is going to be the interest of the stronger, advantage of the stronger. But who's going to be the stronger? We are going to be the stronger, right? The citizens are going to be the stronger. And justice is going to be in our advantage. Maybe in everybody's advantage, in everybody's interest. So it's going to be the interest of the stronger. And in this harmonious society, we're going to be best able to help our friends. And, is a just city going to have enemies? Well, for Socrates, war is an irreducible fact of life. So yes, if the state if the city-state has to go to war, this harmonious state is going to be in the best position to harm their enemies, or at least to bring the war to a swift close. And also, in doing so, again, you're going to have this harmonious relationship where each part is going to do their proper part, and in this sense, pay their debts to men or even to gods if they exist. And the key to this justice as harmony is meritocratic, or more properly, technocratic knowledge that would allow one to create this harmonious and therefore just polis. So again, the dialogue is about justice, and Plato plays for very high stakes, the highest stakes. So in addition to these three challenges, it's a character whose name is Glaucon. He tells Socrates a story of the ring of Gyges. Right? We're trying to make the challenge sharper. So the ring of Gyges is the ring of invisibility. So Glaucon basically asks Socrates to defend his idea of justice as harmony against the following challenge. So he says, imagine you find a ring of invisibility. This ring turns you invisible, and now you can get away with any injustice. In the original story, the shepherd, Gyges, actually uses this ring to kill the king of his territory, become king himself, and rape the queen immediately, right? And the intimation, the implication of Glaucon's challenge, of this challenge of the ring of Gyges, is that no sane person would ever be just if we could get away with being unjust. And Socrates, in the remaining dialogue, tries to show not justice, not as a mere compromise that, oh, it's a second best, but if you can get away with injustice, go for it. No. He's going to try to paint the picture of human nature and the nature of human societies that, if rightly understood, would provide a genuine harmony, a genuine alignment of interests of the individual and of the social. True common interest. Again, this idea of free obedience. You obey because you freely choose to obey. Presumably, even if you had the ring of invisibility, Socrates seems to imply, you would still choose to be just. Also, maybe, in addition to that, a ring of invisibility that would make you impervious not only to men, but also to gods. Imagine that there are no gods, or maybe they can also be bribed. So justice as genuine common interest, as real harmony, a course of affairs that you would choose to follow, the prescription that you would choose to follow, even if you are in a position to completely disregard other human beings or even the gods. So, justice as harmony. Justice as harmony. In order to demonstrate this relationship between justice and harmony, Socrates proposes some like a thought experiment. He proposes to construct a city in speech. Basically, the presupposition is that justice in the soul and in the city are analogous to one another, but it is easier, it is simpler to see justice in the operation of the city, and then same would be applicable to the interest of the individual. There's therefore some question as to whether Plato intended the Dialogue Republic to be about only individual morality or about politics, or maybe both. Scholars differ. My proposed solution is that Plato meant both. It's impossible to know, but I'm going to read the dialogue as if it genuinely talks about what is good morally for the individual and what is also good politically, with some intimation that the political program is not just an empty utopia, but could actually be realized in reality. Maybe hard to do, but still at least possible. So Socrates begins with a vision of what he calls a healthy city. A healthy city. It is a small agricultural commune. By and large, like a classless society, maybe reminiscent a little bit of Rousseau's simple agricultural republic, or reminiscent of Marx's primitive communism. It's a simple society. It has some primitive, in a technical sense, division of labor, but the harmony of this society is natural. It's a simple society, and the harmony is natural in the same fashion that the harmony in a family is natural. This society is quite, again, primitive in a technical sense of the term. It is also quite poor, and the citizens rely on each other constantly, right? So there's no real incentive to lie, to cheat, to steal, because, again, day in and day out, you rely on interactions between each other. Reminds me a little bit of Durkheim's organic solidarity. The shoemaker helps the blacksmith, helps the farmer. They're all in the same boat. It's a, again, small, simple city. Again, harmony, natural and simple. In response to this vision of the healthy city, and I think we should not forget this vision of the healthy city, since I think Plato means it, or Socrates means it quite seriously as a possibility. But Glaucon, again, one of the main characters of the dialogue, actually supposedly Plato's brother, poses a challenge. He says it is a city for pigs. More specifically, it's a city for pigs because it is a vegetarian city. They are too poor to afford meat. More specifically, if you want to eat meat, you need more land for pasture. But if you're going to expand your city, you're now going to need to defend it. So there's this interesting issue. People want more than just bare necessities of life. We want luxury. We also want not just luxury, but also leisure. And this would give us possibility of progress. So and Socrates is going to talk, he's going to say, your city is going to have luxury, and now it's going to be an inflamed or feverish city. The small agricultural commune, in an important respect, was healthy, but this city of luxury, the progressive city, is going to be inflamed. It's going to be problematic. But it's inflamed, but it provides opportunity for leisure, and therefore for philosophy, and also for progress. Very importantly, I think, later philosophers such as, let's say, Hegel or Marx, are going to say that it is right and proper in the scope of human history that humanity moves from the simple hunter-gatherer stage to a more advanced progressive stage. Yes, it involves a certain internal conflict, but these are, if you want, growing pains, and humanity has to grow through these pains. Again, so through the lens of this dialogue, Plato's Republic, you can see the later history of political philosophy unfolding. Now, let us look in closer detail at this inflamed city. Now, immediately, right, the city becomes inflamed because it needs more wealth, needs luxury, if you want luxury of leisure. Philosophy only seems to be possible in an inflamed city. In the healthy city, it's just too poor. People don't have free time to philosophize. So everything begins with amassing more wealth than is immediately needed. Now, the immediate problem with that is that if your city is going to be wealthy, this is going to invite conflict. This is going to invite enemies. And first and foremost, you will need to protect the city. So in the healthy, simple, harmonious city, there were no classes. All people were approximately equal. But now we need a separate caste of soldiers. We need a separate caste of soldiers in order to protect the city. However, if you're going to have a class of soldiers, class of soldiers, your city runs into a certain problem. It runs a certain risk. The soldiers, armed men, who knows, maybe armed men and women. Plato actually thinks that women in principle can be as skillful fighters as men. Now that they have the force of arms at their disposal, they will be tempted to take the city under their control and install themselves as a military junta. So if you have luxury, you need the soldiers to protect your luxuries, protect your wealth. But if you have the soldiers, you need to somehow defend yourself, protect yourself, guard against the potential of military dictatorship, so that the soldiers don't just end up enslaving you. So you have to try to control them somehow. And the best way to control the soldiers, according to Socrates, is through education. So now, in addition to the soldiers, you will need the class of educators. And these are customarily called philosopher kings, but very importantly, philosopher kings and queens. Long separate discussion, no time to go into this. Was Plato a feminist? Well, people define feminism in different ways. At the very least, Plato was committed to the idea of equality of opportunity. Radical equality of opportunity in his society as a whole, and specifically equality of opportunity between men and women. So if you want meritocracy, no glass ceilings. And preliminarily, Socrates suggests that there's no reason to disqualify women from service in the army or from the rulership. So these, again, it's important to understand. This is not philosopher king in the singular. We're not talking about a monarchy. We're talking about philosopher kings and queens. It's a technocratic caste. These are the people who, in the most direct sense, oversee the harmony in the city, the harmonious constitution of the city. But specifically what they do, first and foremost, is through the force of education, they control the soldiers. Now, you could say, okay, so we have philosophers and soldiers. Do we need something else? Well, yes. Socrates says we need producers. And again, the implication is, I guess, one way to read the dialogue is as follows. That within the ancient worldview, for some people to devote themselves, to devote their lives entirely to study, you need other people who will protect them, and you need a third class that will produce for both, right? And I suppose, again, the tacit assumption is that a harmonious city, an effective control is only possible if these people are really going to be experts. But in order for them to become, this technocratic caste, let me write the word technocracy. In order for them to really become expert technocratic caste, they need to devote themselves to this wholeheartedly. Let's say a society in which everybody does everything is going to fall apart because the experts are not going to be expert enough, right? So likewise, for some people to be free, other people, broadly speaking, have to be servants, have to serve, have to be, well, not exactly slaves, but have to be in the subservient position. And I feel that Plato's Republic is shot through with a deep feeling of pessimism. I think that Socrates or Plato embraces this picture with a heavy heart. This, technically speaking, is an evil. Remember, for Socrates, a life worthy of a human being is the philosopher's life. But in Plato's, or Socrates' ideal city, at best, only a third of the population, probably less, will be properly human and properly just. And the two other classes will have to be, strictly speaking, less than fully human, less than fully just, less than fully rational. Again, I feel we must understand, or at least the way I read the dialogue, is that it is an evil, but it is a necessary evil. There's no other way to organize a society. Parenthetically, let me note that future philosophers, I'm thinking first and foremost of Karl Marx here, maybe Hegel as well, will try to redraw the schema. So Marx imagines this potential future utopian communism, and it's important for Marx that communism exists as world communism. If the whole world is united under a single communist banner, then presumably you don't need soldiers. And if you don't need soldiers, this is kind of a way to do away with this class structure so that everybody, the whole society, can be made of philosopher kings, especially if you think of this in terms of technological progress. That is very important for Marx. Technological progress, which is basically done through science, right? So ruled by experts, but everybody is an expert. So I want you to see the amazing fruitfulness of Plato's dialogue, right? So of the Dialogue Republic. So even though the communist option is not explicitly explained in Plato's Republic. Plato does not or cannot imagine, but it is implicit there. It is implicit in the dialogue. So I wrote the word technocracy here. Often I'm tempted to also call this republic, Kallipolis, in Greek, the beautiful city, tempted to call it meritocracy, but kind of with a question mark. Because you see, again, Plato is deeply committed to equality of opportunity. So maybe let me write the word meritocracy, but with a question mark. Plato is committed to the equality of opportunity. However, one has to understand that society needs all three classes. So Plato's assumption is that actually the philosopher kings, and this is a deeply disturbing and deeply pessimistic view, and I don't think that Socrates or Plato takes it lightly, that the philosopher kings will have to engage in the eugenic project. So there's going to be eugenic lottery, where the philosopher kings and queens actually arrange marriages throughout society to make sure that the city has enough soldiers and enough producers. Eugenics. And again, in my own interpretation, I think Plato would recognize this, technically speaking, as an evil, but as a necessary evil. No other way to organize a society. So, in many ways, philosophers will breed enough soldiers and enough producers. On the flip side, I'm not sure if this is much consolation, but again, meritocracy is still there, because if it happens, and Plato, Socrates, believes that sometimes it will happen, that let's say a philosopher, a gifted child will be born to a family of soldiers or to a family of producers, in this case, they should be promoted. So at the end of the day, people have to occupy positions in society to which they are suited best. So you could call it a meritocracy, but it is a limited meritocracy. Meritocracy limited by this eugenic project. Now, another problem is that we can already see, right? This is not a, we're talking about harmony, right? The vision of harmony, but it's not a perfectly harmonious arrangement. It's full of these necessary evils. So in order to sustain this order, in order to make the soldiers and producers go along with the eugenic lottery, and in general with the rule of philosopher kings and queens, we will need ideology. The society will need ideology. Now, in principle, if soldiers and producers were philosophers, they could understand the reasons for the political decisions, for the political arrangements. But remember, they are less than rational, and therefore they cannot really understand. So, Plato is a sophist. They have to be rhetorically persuaded without really understanding the justice of the city. So this is the idea of the noble lie. So noble lie that is going to rule over the soldiers and the producers. And this noble lie, in general, covers with an ideological panoply, covers the entire city. So, myth of the metals, that human beings occupy their positions in society because they are made of a certain metal by nature. But I suppose much more importantly and much more interestingly is that the noble lie encompasses ideas of religion. This is, again, if you want, the subordination of religion to the purposes of the state. Remember Critias, it's not gods who make men, but men invent myths of gods in order to stabilize the social bond. This should remind you of Protagoras. Justice is a convention because the alternative is far too horrible. And so we need religious myth. We need a noble lie, but lie nonetheless. Thrasymachus, justice is the interest of the stronger. It is a lie that the rulers tell to the population at large. What is the difference between Socrates and Thrasymachus? Well, the difference is supposed to be that the philosophers tell this lie genuinely in the interest of the city. Are we really expected to believe this? Well, it's a complicated story. Plato has an answer, or Socrates has an answer. I'm not sure if you will be satisfied with an answer. And I'm sure that Plato in general understands the problem. Plato is, or Socrates is pessimistic about this arrangement. He believes that, in the same way how all human beings are mortal, everybody is going to die, all cities are also mortal. So this arrangement is not stable in the long run. And the immediate danger actually comes from the soldiers. He thinks that this will disintegrate when the soldiers at some point, the arrangement comes loose and the soldiers take over. And this philosophical aristocracy is going to be supplanted by what Plato calls, or Socrates calls, timocracy, basically a military junta, which is exactly what we were afraid of from the very beginning. But still, let us ask, why does Plato believe that this can be sustained even for a short while? Now remember, we're talking about the city and the soul. The city and the soul. There are parts of the city, these three parts, but there are also parts of the soul. What are the parts of the soul? It's a very important idea in Plato, that human beings are driven by passion. It's a notion that we will be coming back to over and over and over again. David Hume is going to say, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passion. Human beings are driven by passions. Now, more specifically, Plato is going to say that there are three distinct categories of passions to which human beings are subject. The first is passion for pleasure. We have talked about this. Kallipolis is a man who is driven by passion for pleasure. Then, another passion in the human soul is the passion for honor. Polemarchus, the patriotic soldier, is driven by honor. And then there's a third passion for knowledge. This isn't just simple, sterile, calculating reason. No, it's a deep, burning desire to know, desire for knowledge. These are three different kinds of desire. And Plato, Socrates, appears to imagine that the human being is made of, roughly speaking, three parts. The part of the soul that desires after pleasure, the part of the soul that desires after honor, and the part of the soul that desires after knowledge. And these three parts are unequally distributed among human beings. To some extent, the constitution of one's soul is inherited from one's parents, as we see by appeal to eugenics, but to some extent it can be molded by society. So the philosopher kings are supposed to be dominated, psychologically dominated by the desire to know, the soldiers dominated by desire for honor, thumos in Greek, and the producers dominated by desire for pleasure. And by organizing these desires in a hierarchy, the individual becomes harmonious and the city becomes harmonious. Although again, as I mentioned, strictly speaking, it is only in the philosophers where the desire for knowledge rules and appetite and desire for honor is subordinate. So strictly speaking, the just individuals are only exemplified by the philosopher kings and queens, and soldiers and producers are in this fashion of unnecessary evil, are less than just, and they are only properly just when they are ruled by knowledge, by right reason, but not their own reason, because their own reason is underdeveloped, but by the reason of philosophers. Now, one of the highlights of Plato's Republic is the famous Allegory of the Cave. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no time to go into it in any detail. I hope you will read it on your own, but let's just say a couple of words. How does the Allegory of the Cave relate to this? Now, in the most immediate fashion, the Allegory of the Cave illustrates this idea of the noble lie. So, the Allegory of the Cave works like this. The soldiers, Socrates doesn't say it, so I'm doing a bit of my own interpretation. Soldiers and producers are sitting chained as prisoners, and they are looking at the wall of the cave. And behind them, there's a system of light and shadow. There's a fire. And the philosopher kings, they project certain puppets, certain toys, so that the soldiers and the producers see shadows on the walls of the cave, right? They do not see the real world as it really is, but they see the world as it is presented by the philosophers. Now, Socrates doesn't say that. Right? Socrates mostly talks, it seems he talks about the sophists or about political arrangement in general. So my own interpretation would be this, that in any kind of functional city that Socrates can imagine, the vast majority of people will not have knowledge, but will only see shadows on the walls of the cave. You can think today of media, right? Media in the internet or television, radio, right? And the rulers are projecting certain ideas, they cast certain shadows. In most societies, which are probably bad, according to Socrates, it is the bad politicians, it is the shrewd politicians, the sophists, the rhetoricians, that project whatever they want on the walls of the cave in order to suit their own interest. But even in the best polis, you still need this projection, you still need this noble lie. So instead of the evil, sophistic puppeteers, you're going to have these good, benevolent philosopher king and queens puppeteers. But still, the noble lie is there. And the noble lie is important and effective. Another way to interpret the allegory of the cave is not in this political sense, but in the metaphysical sense. And in the metaphysical sense, the allegory of the cave is supposed to illustrate Plato's theory of forms or ideas. The Greek word is eidos or idea, so theory of forms. And the notion is that beyond the material world of physical objects that you can see and touch with your senses, beyond this world, there's another, more perfect world of eternal and changeless ideas, eternal and changeless knowledge. So as opposed to let's say, imperfect triangles that you can try to draw on a board. This isn't really a perfect triangle, but your mind can see through this triangle to the idea of the triangle that supposedly exists, which is perfect, changeless, and eternal, which exists somewhere, not beyond space in this other realm, metaphysical realm of eternal truths. If this was a course in metaphysics or epistemology, would spend much more on this idea, but right here, right now, in the course of political philosophy, let me just alert your attention to the following fact. The theory of forms appears quite rarely in Plato's dialogues. He doesn't appeal to it all that often. And when he does, Plato doesn't treat this as religious truth with a capital T. I think, this is super controversial, I have to warn you, but I think that for Plato, and even for Socrates, if he really believed in the idea, in the notion of forms, I don't think that this is a truth with a capital T, but this is more of a hypothesis or a research project. That maybe, beyond this chaotic world of death and decay, maybe there's another world of eternal and changeless truths. And so philosopher kings and queens, by going through long years of study, can gain access to these forms. And by gaining access to them, they acquire, again, knowledge of truth with a capital T, and therefore they can organize society in a harmonious fashion. If Plato really did believe in the theory of forms, this would be the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato. But I think it's quite possible that Plato did not believe in the theory of forms or saw some problems with it and only treated it as a hypothesis. If that is so, then this would make Plato a kind of a Protagorean sophist. We do not know whether there really is justice with a capital J in this world. We do not know. But we assume that there is one for the sake of establishing social harmony. Again, in many ways, I think this foreshadows very famous idea by Immanuel Kant that we cannot know whether God exists or not, but we have to postulate, we have to assume that God exists for moral reasons, basically because otherwise morality is impossible. It's a very unorthodox reading of Plato, but I do invite you to look at the Republic from this side also. Now, one last word about the Republic. So presumably my own way of reading the dialogue is that Socrates means this political project quite seriously. It's not easy to achieve, but possible. Starts with an interesting proposition to take the children below the age of 10 and to establish a new colony with them. Greeks were known for their colonial practices. I suppose Greek colonies, apoikia, is different from later colonies, European colonies of the 19th century. But still, this idea of founding a new city, even potentially with children, I don't think was so outrageous. The proposition of gender equality, I think, scandalized Plato's contemporaries much more. Still, so the regime, the best regime that Socrates portrays in the Republic could be called aristocracy from the Greek word ariston, which means best. So aristocracy is ruled by the best. However, we already mentioned, it is less, it is the best, it is the most harmonious achievable. Among the achievable regimes, it is the most harmonious. But this world is a world of change, death, and decay. Nothing lasts forever. And even this aristocracy will not last forever. So Socrates tells of a particular progression. So he says what's going to happen is that eventually the society will come loose. And maybe the eugenic lottery will go out of whack. And gradually what's going to happen is that the soldiers will take over. And this is called timocracy, again from the Greek word thumos, which means honor or glory. Again, desire for honor or glory will degenerate. And timocracy is now, in this schema, kind of a second best regime. Eventually, it's going to be the ruled by the rich, oligarchy. And then the oligarchy, according to Socrates, will degenerate into a democracy. Now you can see Socrates was not a fan of democracy, and there's a whole separate discussion to be had as to why. And then finally, and this is a deep indictment of democracy, democracy will degenerate into tyranny. And there's an important, interesting historical analogues where a tyrant comes to power by appealing to popular sentiment. So this is a particular specific kind of a tyrant, a populist tyrant, like Pisistrates in Athens, or maybe like Caesar. There are other historical examples. I will leave it to you to fill in the details. So the deep pessimism in this picture. However, let's talk about democracy a bit more, because in Plato, in Socrates, despite the criticism, there's a certain limited defense of democracy. Now, more specifically, when you try to think about this whole arrangement in realistic terms, most of us do not find ourselves in these Platonic republics. We are not born into these republics. They are very rare and they don't last for a very long time. So, realistically speaking, what should you do? Again, we talked about this. Should we be conservative? Preserve our societies? Should we maybe try to reform them? Revolt against them? Who knows? Again, in this question of conflict and consensus, do we find ourselves in conflictual societies or in consensual societies? Well, at the very end of the Republic, Socrates tells a story of the myth of error, the myth of the afterlife. And in this myth, a very interesting passage, Odysseus, after he died, is choosing his next fate. And in fact, the souls of the dead, and among them in this line of souls of the dead, Odysseus is last. And he takes a particular lot that nobody else wanted. It's a lot of a calm life of a private citizen. Calm, unadventurous life of a private citizen. Odysseus, supposedly the wisest of Homeric heroes, he chooses last, but when he chooses the life of a private citizen, he says, this is the best life. And even if I was to choose first, this would have been my best choice. An individual, private, anti-political solution to the problem of politics. If you are born in a society which is less than harmonious, maybe this project of founding a new city is unavailable to you. But you can always lead your own life in a proper fashion with the benefit of philosophy if you are lucky enough to be exposed to philosophical ideas and to have the leisure to engage in philosophy and the talent to engage in philosophy. And here is this limited defense of democracy, because in the dialogue, Socrates, remember, it's a private dialogue behind closed doors. But Socrates says to his interlocutors, this kind of dialogue, the Republic, the Plato's dialogue, Republic, right, can only take place in a democracy. In no other regime would we be allowed as private citizens to carry out these conversations and to ask, what is the best regime? So maybe sort of take this very much with a grain of salt, but maybe it is only from within a democracy can one imagine Platonic aristocracy, this technocratic aristocracy. It's an ominous question, very important question. This is rule by the best, rule by experts. But who, the educators, but who, as Marx says, who will educate the educators? Who will educate the educators? Who will supervise the experts? You know, they're found on the basis of exams, but who will make sure that the exams are actually finding people who are best? Again, in this Protagorean fashion, maybe there is something to be said for democracy. Take it with a grain of salt. Take it with a grain of salt. I don't mean to say that Plato endorsed democracy. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle later all seem to be very pessimistic and mistrustful of especially Athenian-style direct democracy. But there is something of a limited defense. Let's keep this in mind. It's an important idea that we will keep returning to. Okay, colleagues. I hope you found our discussion of Republic interesting and stimulating. I find this to be an infinitely stimulating dialogue. So next time, we will take up the mantle of the dialogue. We will talk about the next great philosopher in line, the student of Socrates, the student of Plato, Aristotle.